Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for coming. And aren't we lucky to be here? Good morning. Okay, we're gonna talk about metaphor this morning. It's one of the most wonderful things in the world. So I thought I'd mess around with it. Metaphor is omnipresent in literature. From the smallest level, that of images or figures of speech, to the largest found in character and plot, metaphors are much more than decorative elements to our work. According to I.A. Richards, metaphor is the omnipresent principle of language itself. We cannot get through 3 sentences of ordinary fluid discourse without it. In the broadest sense, metaphor often determines our basic structures of language, thought, and perception. In the following hour or so, I'll be sharing with you some of the more remarkable instances of metaphor making and metaphor consciousness that I'm aware of, in order to encourage you to pay close attention to the metaphorical turn, the metaphorical image, the metaphorical power in your own work. In his beautiful book, An Elemental Thing, Elliot Weinberger includes I don't know whether it's a chapter, a prose poem, poetic essay, or collage. It's very much its own thing, which he calls The Stars. He collates the myths and beliefs about the stars from cultures around the world and presents them to us in short sentences and clauses over 6 pages of text. What are myths anyway, if not extended metaphors we use to explain to ourselves the inexplicable? I've selected several sections and have structured the following talk around them. I hope the strange and overwhelming beauties of the many diverse metaphors represented in this piece will serve as a sustained harmonic note, an ostinato, if you will, to the music of the following talk. From Elliot Weinberger's The Stars. The stars, what are they? They are chunks of ice reflecting the sun. They are lights afloat on the waters beyond the transparent dome. They are nails nailed to the sky. They are holes in the great curtain between us and the sea of light. They are holes in the hard shell that protects us from the inferno beyond. I didn't have these selections copied, so you don't. I could hear the rustling of the pages. And on the back is just my talk. It wasn't supposed to be a copy, but now you know, you can read ahead. Metaphor is the queen of tropes. Metaphor is the secret weapon in every writer's backpack. Metaphor is the giver of life. Metaphor is the magic wand that can make a brave new world spring out of a handful of words. The stars. They are the daughters of the sun. They are the messengers of the gods. They are shaped like wheels and are condensations of air with flames roaring through the spaces between the spokes. They sit in little chairs. They are strewn across the sky. They run errands for lovers. They are composed of atoms that fall through the void and entangle with one another. They are the souls of dead babies turned into flowers in the sky. In Greek, metaphor means to carry over. Willis Barnstone, an all-around linguistic genius at home in 12 different languages, opens his marvelous book called The Poetics of Translation with a striking visual: motor vans all across Athens and beyond, driving around with the word metaphor printed on their sides. What are they? They're moving vans, yes. They are literally carrying objects from one environment to another. Very much as we do with ideas, images, themes, and/or emotions when we create a literary metaphor. The stars. They are birds whose feathers are on fire. They impregnate the mothers of great men. They are the shining concentrations of spirit breath made from the residues left over from the creation of the sun and moon. They portend war, death, famine, plague, good and bad harvests, the birth of kings. They regulate the prices of salt and fish. Of course, we use different kinds of metaphor in different situations. Common, as distinct from literary metaphor, is an ever-present element of our everyday speech and communication and always has been. When, for example, we indicate at the most basic level that we understand something, we say, "I see." This is a metaphor. We're using one of the oldest metaphors in common usage throughout the entire Indo-European language group. We may not understand this equation to be a metaphor because it's so ancient and so commonplace, but once upon a time, the two elements had to have been put together for the very first time. Aristotle, could he have been the one, asserts the equation early on. He says, literally, seeing equals knowing. People everywhere use the metaphor in extended ways. When you say, "I'm in the dark," you mean you can't see, and therefore you don't understand. When someone's argument is crystal clear, we are seeing and understanding it very well. Some researchers even suggest that metaphor making may be hardwired into our neural pathways by way of a fundamental kind of synesthesia. Here's a little experiment. If you look at the blots on the first page of your handout, one of these blots is a bouba, B-O-U-B-A, and the other is a kiki, K-I-K-I. Which is which? Kiki on the left, bouba on the right. Now, why do we decide this? The sharp sounds belong to the sharp points of the kiki. It turns out 98% of everyone who considers the question, including children as young as 2.5, confidently associate the spiky blot with the sharp-sounding name of kiki, the rounded blot with the softer-sounding bouba. Turns out the visual and auditory pathways in the brain are located very close to one another. They often fire in unison when subjects are presented with a single stimulant. For example, several musician friends of mine claim that they see colors when hearing certain chords. Can any of you do that? I'm extremely jealous if you can. I can't imagine what the world must be like to see color when you hear sounds. One of my friends used to tell me, "Oh, the C-sharp major chord is very bright yellow." Here, in associating the spikiness of the sound of the name kiki with the visual spikiness of the blot, we are transposing one sense onto another using synesthesia, or the blending of sense impressions. The stars. They are the seeds of all the creatures on earth. They are the flock of the moon, scattered across the sky like sheep in a meadow, and she leads them to pasture. They are spheres of crystal, and their movement creates a music in the sky. They are fixed, and we are moving. We are fixed, and they are moving. James Geary, the author of I, the pronoun I, is an other, The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes the Way We See the World, has this to say about metaphor. Synesthesia creates the experience of one sense in the context of another. Metaphorical thinking creates a kind of conceptual synesthesia in which one concept is understood in the context of another. The abstract is understood in the context of the concrete, the metaphysical in the context of the physical, the emotional in the context of the biological. Through metaphor, body and mind are inextricably intertwined. According to Albert Einstein, productive thought is what he called combinatory play, where one entertains two concepts at the same time, and together they create a third. The processes of combinatory play mirror exactly the processes of metaphor making and enlarge our understanding of the concrete world in front of us and our understanding of the way the world works in general. The workings of scientific creativity are not that far removed from those of literary creativity, after all. The stars. They are the seal hunters who have lost their way. They are the footprints of Vishnu striding across the sky. They are the lights of the palaces where the spirits live. They are of different sizes. They are funeral candles, and to dream of them is to dream of death. One of the cardinal points I insist on in teaching any level of student is to always remember that poetry is a physical art. It began, we assume, millennia ago, with the physical repetition of verbal patterns in song, in prayer, in incantation. Where does the fundamental English language poetic foot, the I am, come from, do you imagine? It mimics the heartbeat. For those of you not familiar with the I am, it is a two-syllable vocal unit with one stress. Words like create, pursue, protect come to mind. The stress is on the second syllable, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. It's a perfect imitation of a physical, voiced by the body expression. It makes use of the similarities of the basic sonic units of life in order to illuminate and enrich the experience of the poem. In my opinion, the best poetry privileges physical rhythm, voiced pattern, fundamental sound. Sort of as an aside, if poetry is fundamentally based in the body, it follows that you can enlist the help of your own body in refining your work. For example, when composing your poems, you must always read them aloud to yourself and or to others. Any stumbling over a word is likely your body telling you there's something wrong with that word or that line. It's an unconscious, perhaps subconscious operation that the tongue itself manages to communicate to your consciousness. Robert Graves tells us that when he hears a great poem, the hairs on the back of his neck begin to rise. When I hear a great poem, the hairs on my arms begin to rise. When Emily Dickinson is in the presence of true poetry, she tells us, she feels as if the top of her head is being blown off. When we attend a poetry reading and the poet reads something to us that we feel is powerful or exciting, new or moving, what do? Exactly. It's almost involuntary. It's a physical response to this work that you so admire. I can confidently tell you that's one of the best experiences in a poet's life, when the audience gives up this physical mark of admiration for your words. Let's see. Since metaphor making is based in the physical and is one of the most fundamental ways of understanding our world and may even be hardwired into us, making good use of metaphor is one of the very best ways to lend power and depth to a poem, or for that matter, any manner of creative writing. The stars. Dew and frost fall from the sky, from the stars. Winds, warm and cold, come from the stars. Stars fall from heaven into a maiden's lap. They are the embers of the fire of creation. They never change. They are the white tents where the star people live. They are the countless eyes of Varuna, who rides across the sky on Makara, who is half bird and half crocodile, or half antelope and half fish. Let's take a look at a poem written by one of the very greatest metaphor makers of the 20th century, Sylvia Plath. This is an early poem called A Winter Ship. At this wharf, there are no grand landings to speak of. Red and orange barges list and blister, shackled to the dock, outmoded, gaudy, and apparently indestructible. The sea pulses under a skin of oil. A gull holds his pose on a shanty ridgepole, riding the tide of the wind, steady as wood and formal, in a jacket of ashes, the whole flat harbor anchored in the round of his yellow eye button. A blimp swims up like a day moon or tin cigar over his rink of fishes. The prospect is dull as an old etching. They are unloading three barrels of little crabs. The pier pilings seem about to collapse, and with them that rickety edifice of warehouses, derricks, smokestacks, and bridges in the distance. All around us, the water slips and gossips in its loose vernacular, ferrying the smells of cod and tar. Farther out, the waves will be mouthing ice cakes, a poor month for park sleepers and lovers. Even our shadows are blue with cold. We wanted to see the sun come up and are met instead by this ice-ribbed ship, bearded and blown, an albatross of frost, relic of tough weather, every winch and stay encased in a glassy pellicle. The soon will diminish it soon enough. Each wave tip glitters like a knife. This poem always takes my breath away, and as I wrote that, I thought unconscious physical metaphor. Aside from its incredible formal dexterity, the metaphors here are as fresh and illuminating as they come. The barges are shackled to the dock. You can feel the constriction and cold of the shackles on your own wrists. The sea pulses under a skin of oil. The sea here is not only a living creature, but it seems to have a hidden, malevolent violence that the skin of oil just barely contains. The water slips and gossips like human chatterers, the alliteration of the S's hissing like snakes and adding to the power of the metaphor. The waves will be mouthing ice cakes. This is one of my favorite metaphors of all time. You can physically feel the chill of the ice cakes in the mouth. You notice how every one of these metaphors involves physical sensation. It's what gives them their extraordinary power. Even our shadows are blue with cold. Even though the poem itself could be said to be a metaphor for the hostility of nature, and even though the poem ends on a threatening note, the brilliance of the images, the liveliness of the action all around, even, I would say, the decidedly cheerful notes in the poem written into the metaphors wrestle and clash with the cold undercurrents to create a vividly whole living scene. They are unloading 3 barrels of little crabs. The scrabbling of these lively creatures adds a sprightly, quietly humorous touch, I think. This is a poem that, thanks to its metaphors, lives in and tugs at the body. In my opinion, it's awful but cheerful, to quote another fine metaphor maker, Elizabeth Bishop. The stars. The sky is solid lapis lazuli flecked with pyrite, which are the stars. Each star has a name and a secret name. The only word we hear from them is their light. Men will never compass in their conceptions the whole of the stars. Under a starry sky on a clear night, the hidden power of knowing speaks a language with no name. Let's look at the work of another poet exceptionally handy with the metaphor, Les Murray. Shoal. I and I and I each. What blinks is I, unison of the whole shoal. Thinks a dark idea circling by, again the eye's eye winks. I and I near no eye is no I, though gill pulse drinks and nervy fins spacewalk. Jinx jets the jettisoned back into all, tasting, each being a tongue, vague umbrations of chemical, this way thrilling, that way wrong. The pure, always inimical, compound being, even the sheer thing I suspend I in and thrust against for speed and feeding, all ear blades for the eel's wave gust over crayfish's unpressured beating, for bird dive boom, redfin's gaped gong. This poem is body and soul, itself a metaphor for what it must feel like to be present in the swirl of consciousnesses that make up a shoal of fish, or, since a single fish here is a non-starter, the shoal as the soul of the compound being. The homophones, the uniform vocalizations in the first half of the poem even mimic the mirroring of the physical action here, the eye-to-eye connections, eye-to-eye connections. What blinks is I, unison of the whole shoal. Every element of these metaphors is sensorial in nature, tasting, each being a tongue, or the vague umbrations of chemical, this way thrilling, that way wrong. The poem is in constant, twitchy, swirling motion, echoing the visuals of the whole shoal. It privileges sound, but not at the expense of texture. The reader can feel the almost sonic explosion of the bird dive boom and resonate to the doom-laden tolling of the redfin's gaped gong. The stars. They are the never-vanishing, in the form of swallows feeding on the fruit of the tree of immortality that grows on the island in the lake of the green falcon. They glisten, twinkle, sparkle, flash. They are delightful. They are portents of evil. They are the eyes of Thiasse flung into the sky by Thor. They are the white ants in the anthill built around the motionless Dorva who meditates for eternity deep in the forest. They are a kind of celestial cheese churned into light. Another poem, whose whole body, it seems to me, functions overall, as does the metaphor, is this section in a long series called Squarings. This is section 8, which appeared in Seamus Heaney's remarkable book, Seeing Things, and which itself, as the book title suggests, is a strongly metaphorical attempt to help us to know, to understand some of the greater mysteries of the world. The annals say, when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayer inside the oratory, a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails, and then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. This man can't bear our life here and will drown, the abbot said, unless we help him. So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvelous as he had known it. In one of Heaney's Oxford lectures, he said that implicit in this poem was something he wanted to affirm in the lecture series that, quote, within our individual selves, we can reconcile two orders of knowledge, which we might call the practical and the poetic. End quote. Here we have an explicit description of the superimposition of one pattern on another and the blending of those patterns essential to the operation of metaphor. He goes on to say, quote, that each form of knowledge redresses the other and that the frontier between them is there for the crossing. Remember the Greek moving vans. The knowledge Heaney speaks of is literally being transported between two worlds. The poem is, he explained elsewhere, quote, about a floating world which proceeds about its own business and yet remains subject to the downward drag of the actual historical world and serves as a warning that if we confine the creature of our imagination too long within the element of our civic and domestic lives, we are likely to stifle them. In an interview in Irish America, Heaney says of the poem that, quote, the thing is a kind of image of poetry itself. It's about the negotiation that goes on in everybody's life between what is envisioned and what is endured, between the dream up there and the doings down here. It has the mysterious purchase of a good story, but it's also pregnant with suggestion. I think it's about poetry, end quote. I do too. Reading this poem, every time I feel, and again to quote Elizabeth Bishop, why do we all feel this sweet sensation of joy? The poem works as a metaphor on various levels about poetry, about the interdependent realms of flesh and spirit, and offers us, in addition, the beautiful affirmation of generosity and great goodwill between strangers and their marvelous worlds. The stars. They are the only gods, and the sun is the chief among them. They are the ostrich hunters out all night, and at dawn they huddle near the sun to get warm, which is why you cannot see them. When I was 30, I suffered through a shattering divorce, which ended up being one of the very best things that ever happened to me. But at that point, it certainly didn't feel like it. During this difficult time, somewhere, I stumbled across this tiny powerhouse of a poem of Denise Levertov's. Someone crossed this field last night. Day reveals a perspective of lavender caves across the snow. Someone entered the dark woods. The poem is about mortality, about journey, about illumination, but mostly, to me, at that difficult moment in my life, it was a metaphor for threshold. The speaker of the poem is standing on the metaphorical threshold that the lever of the prince, the someone who begins the poem, has already passed over. The poem makes beautiful literary use of the very commonplace metaphor, life is a journey. Crossing the field, entering the dark woods, does the journey end here in death or in a strange and new difficulty? Could it represent a raw beginning after a trying period? It employs the Dantean metaphor of the dark woods, the selva oscura, which represents a certain disorientation in the traveler, whether spiritual, physical, psychological, or moral, we can't be sure. Cognitive linguists have come to recognize that we English speakers tend to use a great many fundamental journey metaphors in our everyday discourse. Here are a few examples. His life lacks direction. She's at a crossroads in her life. He's a type A personality. He's really going places. She doesn't let anyone get in her way. These examples are given by Zoltán Kovács, a linguist at a Hungarian university whose name I can't pronounce, who goes on to say this about the metaphors. It seems that speakers of English make extensive use of the domain of journey to think about the highly abstract and elusive concepts of life. Cognitive linguists suggest that we draw so heavily on the domain of journey because thinking about the abstract concept of life is facilitated by the more concrete concept of journey. The key word here is facilitated. We understand or we see things that are often difficult to conceive of more clearly when our approach to them is aided by metaphor. The stars. There are the 7 Portuguese towers, the boiling sea, the place where one bows down. Look, the ostrich is leaving and the ostrich is returning, and the 2 ostriches who are friends. Since we endlessly repeat these metaphorical expressions, it would seem our minds are conditioned to understand the world in the comparative terms of metaphor. George Lakoff writes, "Far from being merely a matter of words, metaphor is a matter of thought, all kinds of thought about emotion, about society, about human character, about language, and about the nature of life and death. It is indispensable not only to our imagination, but also to our reason. Metaphor is a primary tool for understanding our world and ourselves." Intensify your use of metaphors. They will enrich everything. The stars. Look, the Tower of Babel and the felicity of tents. Up there are highway robbers and doves bringing ambrosia to the gods and the twin horsemen of the dawn. Up there, the daughter of the wind mourning for her husband lost at sea. The strong river is there, and the palace of the 5 emperors, the kennel of barking dogs, the straw road, the bird's way, the snake river of sparkling dust. Edwin Arlington Robinson. The sheaves. Where long the shadows of the wind had rolled, green wheat was yielding to the change assigned, and as by some vast magic undivined, the world was turning slowly into gold. Like nothing that was ever bought or sold, it waited there, the body and the mind, and with a mighty meaning of a kind that tells the more it is not told. So, in a land where all days are not fair, fair days went on, till on another day 1,000 golden sheaves were lying there, shining and still, but not for long to stay, as if 1,000 girls with golden hair might rise from where they slept and go away. This gorgeous poem works to help us understand the natural forces that interpenetrate and act on the body and the mind. The wheaten landscape is magically transformed first into pure gold, and then second into 1,000 girls with golden hair who, of course, will rise and go away. Nature's first green is gold, as Frost says, her hardest hue to hold. There's something delicious going on in both these poems. Gold, which represents the element of solidity, of sure value, almost of eternal solid worth, rises gently and slips ephemerally through our fingers. The poem, in its unadorned and quiet language, unites the large concepts of transience, immanence, and mutability with the frail and passing human form. It begins in darkness, in shadow, ripens from green to gold, and then rises and leaves. The beauty here defies definition, but we know what it is. The stars. Cassiopeia, queen of Ethiopia, who thought she was more beautiful than the Nereids, is there, and her hapless daughter Andromeda, and Perseus, who rescued her with the head of Medusa swinging from his belt, and the monster Cetus he slew, and the winged horse Pegasus he rode. There is the bull who plows the furrow of heaven. Paul Violi, do you know Paul Violi, the poet? He's absolutely stunning. He was one of the most formally inventive poets I've ever read. He would take the most outlandish and unpoetic of forms and turn them into extraordinary poems. One of my favorites, Police Blotter, I've included at the end of the handout. I wanted to read and discuss it, but it's just too long, so you can read it at your leisure and enjoy. In addition to co-opting the form of a police blotter, he created poems out of, for example, an errata sheet, a fireworks catalog, boat names in a marina, a letter of submission to a poetry editor. This is very funny. An excuse to a policeman writing up a speeding ticket, and, as we see in this poem, an insincere apology. The poem is formally classical in most respects, including the title, the sonnet form, the 14 lines, the beginning octet and following sestet, and it delivers a delicious reversal of perspective, much as Haney does at the end of his Lightnings poem. On an Acura Integra. Please think of this as not merely a piece of writing that anyone would fully appreciate, but as plain and simple words that attempt to arouse whatever appetencies you, especially, depend upon language to fulfill, that drench you in several levels of meaning at once, rendering my presence superfluous. In other words, welcome this as a poem, not merely a missive I've slowly composed and tucked under your windshield wiper so that these onlookers who saw me bash in your fender will think I'm jotting down the usual information and go away. He's a genius. He clearly has a specific audience in mind. He assumes the reader of the poem will primarily be the injured party, the owner of the car, but he also assumes this person is a reader of poetry who depends upon language to fulfill his or her longings, one who understands the experience of being drenched in several levels of meaning at once, which is the basic operation of metaphor, as it is centrally of poetry. The language is wonderfully elevated, classically formal, except for the fabulous phrase, which lives at the very heart of the poem, "Who saw me bash in your fender?" The fact that bash ends the line gives it weight and substance and heightens the humor implicit in the contrast of levels of diction. The stars. The Emperor Mu Wang and his charioteer Sao Fu, who went in search of the peaches of the Western paradise, are there. The beautiful Callisto, doomed by Juno's jealousy, and the goddess Marici, who drives her chariot led by wild boars through the sky. I found this next very fine poem by Barbara Jane Reyes recently on the Academy of American Poetry's Poem a Day post. Brown girl has walked into the wild, palms open. See how she lists. The body is bent as light as wind will it, and so you must tread light. Mind the rocks underfoot. You must tread slow. There has been drought. See where water has long ago troughed, has carved her. See how she branches, twisting, her many hands reaching. Her roots also reach, sweetened from reaching. When fire arrives, she toughens. She will slough away the thick. She will be slick and dark beneath the rough. She will mimic the fire her bones remember. Know her bones glisten. See how she rests. The body will fall as time wills it. See how it hollows, how her pieces return to earth, and from her thick trunk mushrooms cluster. her belly a nest of moss and poison. When broken open, see what of her mother she has kept, what of her father, what of the stars. This is a deeply mysterious and, I find, a deeply compelling poem. The double vision we see here are the essences of a brown girl on a journey, that very commonplace metaphor, and that of a long-lived tree, decidedly matriarchal in spirit. In death, they both serve as regenerative sources of energy. The poem begins in struggle, in difficulty. It develops and intensifies the metaphor and ends in the illumination of the infinity of the stars. The stars. There are the sea goat, the Danish elephant, the long blue cloud-eating shark, and the white bone snake. Up there is Theodosius turned into a star, and the head of John the Baptist turned into a star, and Li Po's breath, a star his poems make brighter. When I taught undergraduate poetry classes, I almost always used as anthology a marvelous collection of poems written by mostly younger writers, I mean younger than myself. I highly recommend it. It's called From the Fish House. Does anybody know this anthology? It's quite lively and wonderful. I highly recommend it to any of you who might be teaching undergraduate poetry at the moment. There are a great many wonderfully lively poems in it, among them this beauty by Adrian Matejka. In a note in the text, he says this: "What I tried to do was marry the things that I admire so much about successful rap music, like De La Soul, Tribe, Chick D, Rakim, with the things that are essential to me in poetry. The things that are successful to me in poetry. That combination, if I could achieve it, seemed like it could be a pretty interesting mix. Of course," end quote. Of course, that kind of combinatory play is also what makes for good metaphor. What you need to remember through the entire poem is that the title character, the main character, the rather clueless, newly sexually aware kid of 12, is the person who eventually turns into the narrator of the story. Understanding Al Green. When I was 12, a wiser 16-year-old told me, if you really want to get that, homeboy, you best be bringing Al Green's greatest hits. And if you ain't in the mix by song 5, either she's dyking it or you need to reevaluate your sexual orientation. Know what I'm saying? With those words, I was off. Borrowed Al Green in the clutch in search of that thing. Socks pulled up to my neck. Jerry curl, real tight Hoya's jersey was nothing but regulation, and I knew I was smooth, and I knew I was going to be in the mix by song 5. The whole walk from the ball court, the wise man's words echoed like somebody's mama banging on the door. The panties just be slipping off when the women hear Al's voice. Slippin', because Al hits notes mellow, like the silk that silk wears. His voice is all hard-working nighttime things. Not fake breasts, but you and your woman, squeezed onto the couch, taking a nap while the aquarium stutters beside you, nodding off on drizzly days when you should be at work. The first smoke after a glass of fine wine you know you can't afford. Nobody, not woman or man, knows how to handle Al Green. That girl from Ipanema would have dug Al, her panties flip-flopping right there by the sea. That sexy, passing the far side by, would have stopped to say, "What up?" if they were Al, but they weren't. And neither were you last night when that woman at the club shut you down. "I got a man, blah, blah, blah. Hate to tell you, player, but she's at Al's place right now, asking for an autograph and maybe a little something, something." What is something, something? I don't know, but Al knows. And I'm sure you've heard that old jive about Al getting scalded grits thrown on him. You have to recognize those lies, because he would have started singing, and those grits would have been in the mix too, for real. I never believed the pimp to preacher story anyway. The point is, Al's voice is like G-strings and afro wigs and trying to be quiet when the parents are home. The point is, Al Green hums better than most people dream. In taking on the persona, the language, the cultural assumptions, and the naivete of the 12-year-old, Matejka is enriching our perception of the brilliant, seductive texture of the fabulous Al Green's voice. The metaphors here aren't plentiful, but they're wonderfully convincing. Al hits notes mellow like the silk that silk wears. His voice is all hard-working nighttime things. Al Green hums better than most people dream. Oh my. There's a wonderful odd synesthesia at work here. In the poem of a boy on the threshold of sexual experience, we are given the essence of smooth, the essence in the imagination of an experienced young kid, of the sexual magic of the singer we all admire. The combination of both these dynamics gives us the metaphorical double vision of that something something. The stars. There is the thirsty camel, the camel striving to get to pasture, and the camel pasturing freely. There, the crown of thorns, or the crown that Bacchus gave Ariadne as a wedding gift. Look, the horse's navel, the lion's liver, the balls of the bear. There is Roni, the red deer, so beautiful that the moon, though he had 27 wives, loved her alone. One can't properly discuss metaphor in contemporary poetry without at some point bringing in Anne Carson, another of the 20th and 21st century's preeminent masters of metaphor. This may be because, if we can characterize her extensive body of work in broad strokes, she is constantly examining the question of how we know. She is a classicist by training and inclination, but her literary experiments encompass a great many other historical and cultural moments. She writes about, explores, and learns from diverse sources, including St. Augustine, Emily Bronte, Gertrude Stein, Antonin Artaud, Simone Weil, and the film director Antonioni, to name just a few. Her remarkable long poem, Book of Isaiah, is a retelling of that particular biblical source. She does extraordinary things to the biblical original, which is a complex series written, it is believed, by several hands over several centuries. It is understood to be the first of the books in the Bible to assert the monotheistic model of Judaism. In addition to the themes of holiness, righteousness, and God's plan for Israel, Carson develops a feminist motif and imagines that the wisdom Isaiah gathers along his path as prophet might be similar to the wisdom gathered by Tiresias, in that both prophets at some point in their lives experience the physical realities of living in both male and female bodies. Here's section 4 of that poem. It's in 4 parts. This is the end of it. I didn't copy out for you the entire 4th part, but this is section 4. And when we get to the branch, what that means is this is the place that Isaiah and God always meet if they're going to meet. Book of Isaiah, part 4. When Isaiah came back in from the desert, centuries had passed. There was nothing left of Isaiah but a big forehead. The forehead went rolling around the nation and spoke to people who leapt to their feet and fled. If the nation had taken Isaiah to court, he could have proven his righteousness, but they met in secret and voted to cut him off. Shepherds, chosen ones, skinny dogs, blood of a dog, watchmen all, said Isaiah. Isaiah withdrew to the branch. It was a blue winter evening. The cold bit like wire. Isaiah laid his forehead on the ground. God arrived. Why do the righteous suffer? Said Isaiah. Bellings of cold washed down the branch. Notice whenever God addresses Isaiah in a feminine singular verb, something dazzling is about to happen. Isaiah, what do you know about women? Asked God. Down Isaiah's nostrils bounced woman words, blush, stink, wife, fig, sorceress. God nodded. Isaiah, go home and get some sleep, said God. Isaiah went home, slept, woke again. Isaiah felt sensation below the neck. It was a silk and bitter sensation. Isaiah looked down. It was milk forcing the nipples open. Isaiah was more than whole. I am not with you, I am in you, said the muffled white voice of God. Isaiah sank to a kneeling position. New pain, said Isaiah. New contract, said God. Isaiah lifted his arms, milk poured out his breasts. Isaiah watched the milk pour like strings. It poured up the branch and across history and down into people's lives and time. The milk made Isaiah forget about righteousness. As he fed the milk to small birds and animals, Isaiah thought only about their little lips. As I've said before, poetry, like metaphor, gives us double vision as two things unite to become a third and yet remain themselves. The metaphors in the book of Isaiah, and indeed throughout all of Carson's remarkable work, allow us to envision completely new ideas which may or may not be erroneous, but which are almost always thrilling. "I am not with you, I am in you," said the muffled white voice of God. The stars. Up there is a cloud of dust kicked up by a buffalo, and the steamy breath of the elephant that lies in the waters that surround the earth, and the muddy water churned by a turtle swimming across the sky. Up there is the broken circle that is a chipped dish or a boomerang, or the opening of the cave where the great bear sleeps. Up there, the two donkeys whose braying made such a racket they frightened away the giants and were rewarded with a place in the sky. Richard Wilbur, who in the past graced this conference with his beautiful presence, gives us one of our most iconic poems of metaphor, "Love Calls Us to the Things of This World." The eyes open to a cry of pulleys, and, spirited from sleep, the astounded soul hangs for a moment bodiless and simple as false dawn. Outside the open window, the morning air is all awash in angels. Some are in bed sheets, some are in blouses, some are in smocks, but truly there they are. Now they are rising together in calm swells of halcyon feeling, filling whatever they wear with the deep joy of their impersonal breathing. Now they are flying in place, conveying the terrible speed of their omnipresence, moving and staying like white water, and now of a sudden they swoon down into so rapt a quiet that nobody seems to be there. The soul shrinks from all that it is about to remember, from the punctual rape of every blessed day, and cries, "Oh, let there be nothing on earth but laundry, nothing but rosy hands in the rising steam and clear dances done in the sight of heaven." Yet, as the sun acknowledges with a warm look the world's hunks and colors, the soul descends once more in bitter love to accept the waking body, saying now in a changed voice as the man yawns and rises, "Bring them down from their ruddy gallows. Let there be clean linen for the backs of thieves. Let lovers go fresh and sweet to be undone. And the heaviest nuns walk in a pure floating of dark habits, keeping their difficult balance." This poem of immanence functions as a metaphor very much in the way Seamus Heaney's fable does. It works to reconcile the physical and the spiritual, the daily and the imaginative, the worldly and the poetic. It is about, quote, "a floating world which proceeds about its own business and yet remains subject to the downward drag of the actual historical world," as per Heaney. Joy is a signal character in each poem, even if a little more subtle in the Heaney, but it is present and insisted on in each. Where Heaney's poem begins in the actual and ends in the marvelous, the movement in Wilbur's is in the opposite direction, beginning in the dream up there, and then descending to acknowledge the world's coarser hunks and colors. But they both offer persuasive and moving arguments for the necessity and interdependence of both. The stars. There is the star of 1,000 colors, the hand of justice, the plain and even way. There is the double-double, there the roadside inn, there the state umbrella, there the shepherd's hut, there the vulture. Look, the winnowing fan, there the growing small, there the court of God, there the quail's fire, there St. Peter's ship and the star of the sea, there, look, up there, the stars. I'd like to conclude with one final extended metaphor, that of a parable. It comes from comments Seamus Heaney offers in his exploration of the liminal situation of the literary translator as he discusses his own translation of Beowulf. Here, he ends with a parable of Ted Hughes's, who was a powerful influence on Heaney's development as a poet. The parable to me serves as a metaphor for the operation and the power of poetry itself, and I hope it brings as much pleasure and light to you as it does to me. This is Haney. In Ted Hughes' essay, Myths, Meters, Rhythms, he meditates on the middle state of the writer, poised between his own idiolect and the vast sound wave and sewage wash of the language's total availability, but being the poet he was, Ted Hughes eschewed the use of a technical term like idiolect. Instead, he invented one of his animal parables. One gazelle flicks its tail, and the tail flick goes from gazelle to gazelle right through the herd while they keep their heads down, nonchalantly feeding. To the individual gazelle, it must feel like a communal brief prayer, meaning, while we all exist as one gazelle, I exist as full-strength gazelle, immortal gazelle. Thank you very much.